So I wanted to talk about the eras in jazz music, or just the jazz eras, and how music changed throughout those. You can watch the Ken Burns documentary, History of Jazz. It's like a 10-part documentary, or 12-part documentary about jazz. If you want more detail, but honestly, I don't know all the history, and I'm talking out of my butt a little bit here. But the I'll give a brief overview of some of the things I know about jazz, even though I'm not an expert. I didn't study in school. I've never taken a class on it. I've listened to a couple of podcasts about it, a couple documentaries about it. Here's what I know about jazz. Pre-jazz or primordial jazz was like Chicago, turn of the century. What was it called? Oh shoot, I forgot the name. Ragtime. Pre-jazz was called Chicago ragtime. Ragtime was a very popular type of music. I don't know if it was popular around the country, around the world, but it was popular in Chicago at one time. If you want to listen to where jazz came before jazz was jazz, I'd listen to ragtime. Even though I don't really like ragtime. It sounds like baseball music. Ragtime sounds like the type of music they play like in a baseball game when they're trying to appeal towards like really old people. But I don't really like ragtime, but I liked when jazz started. I just want to tell you where jazz came from. Like pre-jazz was like ragtime. Started in Chicago. A lot of those guys in Chicago went down to New Orleans around like 1915, and they created jazz in the late teens. In the 20s, they invented jazz. A lot of those old ragtime people, or young ragtime people, they moved to New Orleans around the 19 teens and the 20s, and they invented jazz. The most famous of those 1920s New Orleans, so New Orleans was the basis of the jazz world, and you think of jazz really being invented in New Orleans in the 1920s, 19 teens. Um, but the most famous artist to come out of that scene was Louis Armstrong. Everyone should know Louis Armstrong. Um, Louis Armstrong today is probably famous for two things. He's probably most famous for being the most famous jazz artist to come out of New Orleans in the 1920s. He's also famous for being the singer from the 1950s and 1960s because he turned into a singer. Eventually, he didn't just play jazz. After all, he started to sing to the jazz. And what was it? His most famous song is "It's a Wonderful World." It's a wonderful world. I'm not going to say the lyrics. I don't want to be copyright stricken, but everyone knows that Louis Armstrong is "A Wonderful World," or they should know it. Look it up on YouTube if you don't know it. It's a wonderful world. Um, the uh, the but he's probably even better as a jazz. He was even better as a jazz artist than he was as a singer. Even maybe he's more famous for being a singer than he was as a jazz artist. But I think he was better as a jazz artist than he was as a singer because he moved the genre forward so much. His horn was so powerful in the 1920s. Anyways, moving on. 1930s, jazz kind of started to move to New York. It went from New Orleans to New York because New York was the biggest city in the country. New York was where the energy was in the United States. The Empire State Building was being built. There's skyscrapers being built everywhere. Lots of people. New York was the biggest city in the world at that time. There was more population there than any city in the world. So that's where jazz moved to. Jazz was the most popular art form, so it moved to New York. Um, the What if my microphone? I should put a thing in front of my microphone so my spittle doesn't get on my microphone. But I don't know. I'm still learning. Um, so jazz was the most popular form of music in in that time, and New York was the biggest city. So jazz moved to New York, and it turned into big band. Jazz music turned into big band music, and it starts to be music that everybody liked. My grandma favorite music was big band music. Um, the type of music that people dance to. Um, and then Frank Sinatra came out of big band music. He was a lead singer in a big band group, the Glenn Miller group. So Frank Sinatra, a whole genre of music, came out of big band music, and big band came out of jazz. Um, so, and then you had artists like Count Basie and Duke Ellington in the 1940s, 1950s. And Charlie Parker was the biggest big band artist or jazz artist in the 1940s, 1930s. Uh, Charlie Parker was probably the most talented jazz artist of all time. Charlie Parker is probably the most talented jazz artist of all time. He did a lot of drugs and kind of destroyed his life, but Charlie Parker was the most talented jazz artist of all time. So I was just talking about the eras in jazz. So Charlie Parker was big in the 1930s, 1940s. 1950s, you had Duke Ellington, and then Miles Davis and John Coltrane came onto the scene, and that was avant-garde jazz. That was more progressive or modern jazz. That was like avant-garde jazz started in the 1950s, 1960s. Uh, that completely changed the sound of jazz. In the 1970s, you started to hear electronic jazz. I don't know if you call it jazz fusion. I think jazz fusion is like rock with jazz, but I used to hear more electronic jazz starting in the 1970s. Miles Davis had electronic jazz albums that was very dark. I call it dark jazz because it's really dark sounding. Really, you have other artists too in the 1970s making dark electronic jazz. And there was like disco jazz in the late 70s where jazz artists started to make disco music. And jazz artists started to make rock music too with jazz fusion in the early 70s. In the 80s, you had the Chicago School of Jazz making really futuristic. They started making like this futuristic sound of jazz, which was very grim. To me, the Chicago School of Jazz in the early 1980s sounds very grim. And like Sun Ra was also sounded grim. He was like in the 60s and 70s. Sun Ra is very grim jazz. I like that sound. I really like that grim sound of jazz. It makes me think of like brutalism. When I think of a certain type of jazz, I think of like brutalism. When I think of a certain type of jazz, I think of the Twilight Zone. I think of the Twilight Zone, I think of brutalism. Brutalism is an architectural style, in case you didn't know. You should look up brutalist architecture. It's really not. I really like brutalism, even though a lot of people don't like it. I know a lot of people don't like brutalist architecture. I like brutalist architecture. Um, so there's certain types of music, like the early 70s Chicago School of Jazz sounded really brutalist. Like Sun Ra sounds really brutalist architecture style of jazz. Um, and then you had like people like Kenny G in the 1980s. They made jazz more mainstream. Kenny G did backup instrumentation for people like Michael Bolton, people like who was it, Peebo Bryson, and different R&B artists, different pop artists. Kenny G would do backup instrumentation for a lot of artists. In the 1980s, 1980s jazz tried to go pop again. If the pop tried to make a comeback. Kenny G came out an album in like 1987. It was just a popular jazz album. By the time people heard Kenny G, they were like, "This is terrible," and that was when jazz started to be considered elevator music because they play jazz in elevators or they play it at your work office, and people wanted to hear rock or rap or electronic or whatever. They didn't want to hear jazz music when they partied or whatever because jazz was too. I think of jazz as very rational, and I think people started to not like jazz as much because it sounds very rational. It sounds like elevator music. It sounds like too sophisticated. I think people like guitars more and they like rock more because rock sounds more like primordial. It sounds like something cavemen would listen to. Like people want to listen to stuff like cavemen would like rock. If you like Guns N' Roses, everyone wanted to hear Guns N' Roses in the 80s. And so jazz was falling out of popularity, the popular culture. But people still listen to jazz. I still think of jazz as the most sophisticated type of music there is. Um, and Wynton Marsalis, bringing back the old school type of jazz, making jazz more accessible. Wynton Marsalis brought back the 1940s, 1950s type of Duke Ellington type of jazz. A little step away from the Miles Davis, John Coltrane avant-garde school. And Wynton Marsalis in the 80s and 90s and 2000s brought back the most popular type of jazz, which is classic jazz or whatever. So Wynton Marsalis brought it back, said that we can still make this stuff today. That was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Even today, I think, when Marsalis still makes music. Yeah, I think he's doing good. He's maybe in his like 60s or something. I don't know. So Wynton Marsalis brought back the old school type of jazz away from the avant-garde type of jazz. And the old school type of jazz is still the most popular type of jazz today. The avant-garde stuff is not as popular, but I think the avant-garde stuff should be more popular than it is. I think the futuristic kind from Chicago, the Chicago school, and the Sun Ra, the futuristic kind, the brutalist kind, I think that kind should be more popular than it is. I think all of jazz should be more popular than it is. I think Louis Armstrong from the 1920s should be more popular than it is. And I haven't really listened to jazz in the past 10 years, but I have a playlist from like all the jazz music pre-19 or pre-2013. Um, I'm not going to link to it in the description, but I'll keep it a secret for now. But anyways, I think all eras, so I don't really know what kind of jazz they're making in the past 10 years. I would assume it's the same type of jazz they've been making for the past 100 years, the past 110 years, I guess. It's been going on for like, jazz has been going on for 110 years. And I think I think that jazz is more relevant today than no, it's not more relevant. It should be more relevant today than ever. Jazz is the most sophisticated type of music. A lot of people don't want to listen to it because it feels like listening to homework. It feels like doing homework when you're for some people it feels like doing homework when you listen to jazz because it sounds so sophisticated. It sounds so rational. Jazz is the most rational type of music. So a lot of people don't want to listen to rational music. They want to listen to like Guns N' Roses. They want to listen to heavy metal. They want to listen to like I don't know, like Gucci Mane or Juice World or whatever. You know, Juice World is addicted to drugs, but let's listen to him. No, Miles Davis was, or a lot of Charlie Parker was addicted to drugs too, and he made good music. So it doesn't mean a lot of times people use drugs to make good music. Anyways, different story. So that's what I know about jazz. Wynton Marsalis brought back the old school type of jazz, and now today the old school is probably the most popular type of jazz. Though the avant-garde is gaining popularity as time goes on. More people are going to listen to avant-garde type of jazz. Eventually, more people are going to listen to the futuristic jazz, the synth jazz, the dark jazz. The future is going to be dark. The future is so bright, I have to wear shades. You know, the future is going to be really dark, so we have to make the jazz really dark. Let me know in the comments below, what type of jazz do you listen to? What is your favorite era in jazz? I don't have a favorite era. If I had to pick one artist, it'd be Duke Ellington is my favorite artist, but I kind of like the futuristic jazz the most from the 1970s, 1980s. I kind of like that jazz the most. But all of jazz is good. And Miles Davis, I think, invented the futuristic kind of jazz. But he did the avant-garde, then he did the futuristic, the synth jazz, dark jazz. So I kind of like the dark jazz the best because I'm kind of a dark, broody person. I'm like Batman. Let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite era in jazz for the past 110 years. Please subscribe to this channel to be part of the community. And please like this video. It really helps the channel out a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye.